Hi, everyone. My name is Barbara Dillon. I am the editor-in-chief of Fanbase Press. November will see the release of our graphic medicine series, Ripple Effects, which examines life as a superhero with an invisible illness, specifically diabetes. Given that November is also National Diabetes Month, we are doing our part to raise awareness for and educate others about diabetes through interviews like this one. With me today is educator Tim Smyth. Tim, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Barbara.
Absolutely great to chat with you. And Tim, we recently had the chance to get to know one another through Ripple Effect. So I'm curious, how did you first learn about the series and what was your experience in reading through the collected edition?
So I follow Matthew No, who's a Harvard librarian who does a lot of work with graphic medicine. That's a great hashtag to follow. And so he happened to post that he was invited to write the introduction to the Ripple Effects collected edition. And so I'll just read you his opening paragraph because it really just absolutely struck me. And I've known Matthew for a while. And he says, pain creates its own knowledge. If you met me on the street, asked for help in the library, or joined me for a drink at the bar, there's little chance you would notice that I am in pain. If you saw me at work assembling a dozen new book carts, yanking them out of boxes above my head, kneeling down to install their wheels, you'd think nothing of it. But in truth, the pain is there. And so is the weakness and exhaustion, always burning away beneath the surface, hidden under a mask developed and refined every year since I was 17 years old. That mask can be as important a coping mechanism as any medication when you have a chronic illness. And so we'll get into that later, but we'll talk about my son who also has a chronic illness. And I also know, as being a teacher for over 20 years, these are the types of stories with these hidden illnesses that we're all going through something. And so I was really intrigued. And then, of course, I read the book and was absolutely just blown away.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that, Tim, and thank you for sharing Matthew's part of Matthew's foreword. He really is a beautiful writer. The work he does, both as a librarian and with the Graphic Medicine International Collective, is invaluable. So thank you for sharing his words. Tim, as I shared at the beginning of this interview, November is National Diabetes Month, where we're endeavoring to raise awareness for illnesses like diabetes, which some have referred to as an invisible illness or disability. So as an educator and as a father to a child with an invisible illness, why do you feel that's important for us to raise greater awareness for diabetes and other invisible illnesses?
So, of course, we see diabetes on the rise, and I have multiple students who, and particularly one student who I absolutely adore this year, whose cell phone will beep because he had, and so that attention gets drawn. And so you have those conversations. And this idea of like the superhero, invincible, unless you have kryptonite kind of a thing. The story, the ripple effects really makes heroes more personable on a human level. And so I do my best to make sure that every student is seen in the literature in my classroom. And as Matthew said, and I never thought about it, like I had never read anything like this about a hero with diabetes. And so we try to do, intersectionality and reach as many different types of people as we can. But I had zero literature in my classroom. And my classroom looks like this. I mean, so as many resources as we can, because it's such a powerful thing when students can see themselves in that literature. And the fact that somebody can overcome, whether it's depression, anxiety, whatever it might be, and in this case, diabetes, and still choose to be conflicted, but spoiler alert, in the end, to decide to go out and try to save the world, despite those disadvantages and the things that we're all going through something.
Absolutely. Well said, Tim. Now, specifically for this year's National Diabetes Month, each year has its own focus, and this year's is building your healthcare team. Now, to speak on a more personal note, how valuable has your son's healthcare team been to his own health journey?
Yeah, so my son has, of course, a really rare form of meningitis. It's called Mulleray's meningitis, and there's like 16 documented cases. My son, I can't even tell you how many times I've driven behind the ambulance in the middle of the night. My son has chronic pain, migraines. He's in ninth grade now, and I talk openly about it. He's fine with it. He is my own personal superhero. And people can look at him, maybe struggling to tie shoes, maybe having to go to the nurse during class, maybe having, and kind of have those opinions, not knowing what he's going through. And so every year we educate his teachers, who have always been fantastic. And in terms of his medical team, I mean, we're blessed to have a pediatrician, Dr. Shanwan, who we have on speed dial. And in some cases, he will call the hospital before we arrive to explain to the doctors of what it is. My son has had to have his spinal fluid drained, and it's usually my job to calm him down, as multiple people have had to hold him down through that process. And so, my son goes to Comic-Cons with us and does all these things with us, and he tires very quickly. And so we have to be aware of that. And so he's old enough now that he can kind of see the warning signs ahead of time before he stiffens up. And so we've been able to avoid the hospital for quite a few years because of the medical team, because of Dr. Shanwan speaking with him. And we're also lucky to be in an area where we have, University of Pennsylvania, where we have Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, and we have these wonderful research facilities. And including we've stayed over at Johns Hopkins, and so he's part of this research process, and Temple University, and so it's my son's part of this really superhero team trying to figure these things out, so then we can help other kids and other parents. And luckily through social media, in Facebook, we're part of groups, and we can help other parents, and they can help us. And so I had him read this book, and we had the conversation where the character in here has diabetes, but the essays in this book, I mean, we have open stories about people with type 2 diabetes, chronic fatigue syndrome, paranoid schizophrenia, multiple sclerosis, thrombophilia, all these things, I mean, really just made me cry. And I know that my son, although, his specific disease is not in here, it's all these hidden diseases that now he doesn't feel so alone, because mom and dad can say this, and his doctor can say this, but to kind of see, okay, literally, I mean, his world is comic books, and he sees a hero going through something really along those lines is a really powerful tool to have.
Well, Tim, and I want to note, I concur 100% that your son is a superhero, but I also want to acknowledge you and your partner, because I would imagine that that is not an easy journey, both as a parent trying to calm and be empathetic to your child who is going through this strong journey, but to have your own journey and what that must be like. So I think that that is, for everyone out there viewing this, something to know and acknowledge, not only to visualize and have represented the stories of those who are experiencing this themselves, but the family members, the loved ones, and what that experience is like as well. So thank you for your willingness to share your and your partner's journey.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. And that leads to another part in here. There's another layer in this comic about healthcare debt and all the things that the families, you're right, that are going through. And it's really honest and open. So I haven't used this in my classroom yet. In fact, we're going to start getting into personal superheroes next week. And the multiple layers of conversations we can have in my 10th grade classroom, because of the different layers of this comic book. So we have the hook. It's something different. Here's a comic book, but I know that this is going to lead to some powerful conversations in my room.
Absolutely. Well, I'm so glad that the story has been impactful for you and will be impactful for your students, hopefully, as well. Continuing on with the fact that you were a teacher, you've made great strides to bring comics like this one into your classroom as educational tools. What can you tell us about your decision to utilize comics in the classroom, and how have they helped to provide tangible, more accessible lessons to students?
So I'm a 10th grade social studies teacher this year, but I've taught all different levels. So we have, for one thing, comics can help us with language barriers. We have the built-in scaffolding. So there's that piece of it. Reluctant readers, which there's no such thing. You just have to find the right book. But it also, I teach advanced placement and gifted students. I also teach college students and educators. And so when we're teaching about how to analyze a political cartoon or how to annotate a piece of a textbook, my comic book readers are actually the most adept at doing those types of skills, because they know how important those particularly wordless pages are. And so as the United States kind of catches up with the rest of the world and looking at comic books as literacy, so there's the educational aspect of it. It also allows for personal interpretation. And so that's a really powerful piece, that we're not just telling the kids what it means like we do with a prose book. And then there's the novelty, sure, that we're using comic books in the classroom, that you can't underestimate that. But it's also the power of creation, where my students create their own comics too. And so we're really thinking really deep. And it's all really kind of started years ago when Miles Morales first came out. And I had a student that I hadn't connected with, and he came up to me. I was like, "Hey, there's this new Spider-Man, and some people are upset, and some people are excited in this whole conversation." And so we started talking about comic books as artifacts. And this young African American boy came up to me after class, and he was more impressed that Spider-Man looked like him than we had a Black president. And so it dinged in my head that, hey, why don't I start bringing in my own personal passion of hip hop and comic books into the classroom? And so I wrote my master's degree as a reading specialist, using this to engage students of all ages and different level abilities and things. And it's been a really powerful tool, for one, for me as a teacher, because I love doing it. And so that passion translates to the kids. But it's also just another literacy tool. It's never a replacement. We're not replacing prose books. We're not replacing poetry, but it's another powerful tool that we have in our toolbox as educators.
Well, it's so wonderful. And I know I say this in the context of these are very trying times, and it can be very challenging for educators to have the ability to bring additional tools into the classroom. So thank you for your willingness and ability to do so. Tim, I so value your time today. And I'm sure that, as I said, there are lots of viewers out there who either have their own invisible illness or disability, or perhaps are a family member or a loved one of someone who has one. As a final question, for those who may be interested in learning more about ripple effects, what do you hope that they might take away from this story?
It's really just that idea of it sounds simple, but it's just that idea of literally being seen. And I hope, like, by me sharing my son's personal story, by Matthew sharing his personal story, from the brave folks who wrote these essays in here, it allows us to open up conversation. So if you're a loved one, if you're a family member, it can be difficult to, hey, so what's it like to have diabetes, or what? So it opens up those conversations. And so as a, straight white male, cisgendered, kind of a person, I've been able to have really powerful conversations with my students about all these different worlds that I didn't know about. And we're able to do that through the comic. So I think, if nothing else, between the essays that are in here and the comic itself, I think it's going to be a really powerful vehicle to open up those conversations and those understandings.
Well, thank you so much for your kind words about the series. Again, I'm so glad, Tim, that it has impacted you and your family positively, and I hope it will do the same for your students as well. But ultimately, thank you for your time today, and thank you for all of the hard work that you do in educating students. We very much appreciate it.
I appreciate that. Thank you.